to do is just summarize the book for those of you who have not yet read it. Concealed is a memoir, and it's my story about being caught between two opposing cultures at the intersection of medieval Mashhad, the Iranian city of Mashhad, and 20th century America. Keep in mind, Jews have lived in ancient Iran, which is Persia. They've lived in Persia for 2,700 years, making them the oldest community in the Jewish diaspora. The Jews in the city of Mashhad were underground Jews. They were crypto Jews, and they had to balance this life of duplicity and duality. My parents were one of these crypto Jews who lived in the Iranian city of Mashhad. All of this was taking place right through the 20th century. So this is not hundreds of years ago. My parents were living in Mashhad. They were part of a community, an underground community, and they had to pretend, along with their fellow Jews, that they were Muslim. So my mother would wear the black Chador, which is the burqa, covered from head to toe in black with eye slits. She would be looking through eye slits, and she would walk through the streets looking like all the other Muslims. And my father would pray from the Quran in public squares multiple times a day, like all the other Muslim men. Back home, in the privacy and secrecy of their home, they lived as devout Jews. So, often the Jews of Mashhad are compared to the Moranos of Spain. It was a very difficult life, and there was a lot of persecution, because even though they lived this way, the Muslims knew who the Jews were. The Jews lived in a ghetto called Eidgah in the city of Mashhad, and they were often targeted. But to get back to the main theme of the book, my parents came to the United States right after World War II. This was in 1947. This is more than 30 years before the Khomeini Revolution. In 1979, we had the Khomeini Revolution, and many Jews left Iran and came to the United States. Many ended up living in LA from Tehran. My parents' story is rather different, because they came here almost as pioneers 30 years prior, 1947, right after World War II, and really didn't know what they were coming to. They knew what they were leaving. They didn't know what they were coming to. A few years later, I was born. I have two older brothers who arrived here in the States as young children. One was 8, the other was 5 when they arrived. But I was the only American child and the only daughter. And it became a problem, because my parents, specifically my father, had held many of the values of Iran, of the city of Mashhad. I have to be very, very specific, of the city of Mashhad, to our Queens, New York home, and expected to raise me that way. And meanwhile, I'm attending public school. He was not thrilled about that, but he knew that it was a law in the United States and that all children had to go to school. And so there was this push-pull of how to satisfy my parents and how to satisfy my own dreams and aspirations.
That's a good introduction, and let's go into some specific questions. Before we get there, I wanted to make sure people know, if you look up Mashhad, and I think it's spelled M-A-S-H-A-D. In fact, I'm going to launch a poll in a second to see if any of you have heard of Mashhad before today and have read the book. So let me launch that for a second. But if you look it up, you'll note that it is, I believe it's still the case, the second largest city in Iran. And it has over 3 million people. So we're talking about a major place with a lot of history. In the book, you'll learn about the history of the place, how the Jews got there. It is fascinating, and we're going to focus on just a little piece of it, which is Esther's story that relates to the community there. I also wanted to thank, we have our first guest from New Zealand. Corey Sanders is on from New Zealand for CSP, so welcome. So first question I had was, what you mentioned your parents coming here, and the story of how they got here is just incredible in the memoir. They arrived here, and you were born here, your brothers were born there. What Islamic values did your father bring with him from Mashhad into your Queens, New York home? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Again, I have to backtrack. In Mashhad, little girls were married off to older men at a very young age. And that was the norm. It was the norm amongst the Muslims, and the Jews did the same for different reasons, which we'll get into. So for example, my grandmother, this is my father's mother, was married at the age of 9 to my grandfather, who was 29. So I have to stop and let everyone integrate that. You know, a 9-year-old married to a 29-year-old. And the story goes that these men were merchants, and they would go off, travel, do their business, and wait until they heard that their young child bride was menstruating. And once she was, they would come back and have relations with her. So they didn't necessarily have sexual relationships with a 9-year-old, but they were married to a 9-year-old. My mother was forced at the age of 14 to marry my father, who was 20 years older, and he was 34. One of the reasons why the Jews did copy this pattern is because they wanted very much to maintain Judaism, marry within the community, not assimilate. And so if a Muslim should knock on a door and say he wants this little girl's hand, they could very comfortably and truthfully say she's spoken for. So it was one way of insulating themselves and not assimilating. So early marriage, that was what my father knew. And it worked according to him, what he saw. He was not expecting me to get married at the age of 9, but certainly by 14, by 15, when my mother got married at 14, and she had my oldest brother when she was 15. Another theme is literacy. Men learned to read and write in Mashhad, but girls were kept out of classrooms. My mother never stepped foot into a classroom. She remained illiterate. And the prevailing wisdom at the time was that a girl who can't read and write will turn into an excellent wife because she'll be deferential and she will meld into her husband's family, and there'll be harmony within the home. So books were a problem because my father didn't want me to read. And I had to hide my books from a very young age, read them under the covers, under the sheets in my bed at night with a flashlight. And I was terrified that he would catch me because he had banned books when it came to me, not for my brothers. They were allowed to read. And I am growing up in the United States, where I'm going to public school, and we are being introduced to literature. So there was a conflict here, a cultural conflict. And as a child, it was very hard for me. I was a quiet little girl, and I wanted very much to be respectful. And at the same time, I really didn't know how to blend these two worlds.
I should mention that Mashhad is on the Silk Road, so that ties into what you were saying about the men being away for long trips. The Jewish men were involved, and in many ways still involved, I understand, in business in that way. I'm looking at the polls, and most of you have never heard of Mashhad before, and many of you have not, most of you have not read this memoir. So by the end of this, you're going to go buy the memoir and you're going to go read it. It is, I would say, a page turner, but it's very well written and the stories are so unbelievable. And we're going to focus on a few now. You mentioned that your mom, who was an orphan, married your father. She was age 14, he was 34. And the book really is about your relationship with your mother and your father. And Mashhad is always this character back there. So we've introduced Mashhad as the character. Let's talk about your mother and your father. How did each of your parents affect the person who you became?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because they were diametric opposites. My father, who was much older than my mother, was a very strong character, strong authority figure, and he was nonverbal. He was withdrawn, very repressed, a man of few words, a man who did not enjoy conversation, and if he could ban it, he would. And my mother, on the other hand, even though she was 20 years younger, was a fireball. And she was outspoken, irreverent, I would say rebellious, and loquacious. So they were always at odds with one another. And growing up, I found it rather confusing and at times scary because they never agreed. And yet when I look back, I really feel it was a gift to have such different parents because I think it's very important. I now am a strong believer that there should not be a united front, not always. I don't think parents should always have a united front. I think there's a lot to be said for hearing difference, and it forced me to exercise those muscles and start thinking for myself and figure out, is he right? Is she right? Maybe they're both wrong in this example. Maybe there's another way to think. And it was like an open window. And I think it encouraged a lot of autonomous thinking, which benefited me. But there are many comical moments in the book. It's not bleak by any means. And there's a lot of miscommunication, misunderstanding, misinterpretation. And that was also, part of the experience of having two very different parents.
I would say yes. You definitely had one of the most unusual upbringings that I've ever read about. And we talked briefly. This is a memoir, not a biography. It's personal. It's literary. You're a great writer. It's short chapters. Each chapter it has a nice, a very creative heading that relates to what you're talking about. And the funny thing about your father, I mean, I'm not sure I wouldn't want to have grown up in that house. Although I would have been a boy, maybe it would have been much better. Certainly not a female. But your father is quite a character. I just see him. I mean, I see this whole thing as a movie. Your father was unusual. I guess one question which I can jump at is, how unusual were your parents? Were they similar to other Mashhadi parents? Is your dad, like if you spoke to another woman who grew up in New York and had a father from Mashhad, would they have had the same experience? Or was your dad unusual in and of himself, aside from being from Mashhad?
They were each extremes. The common ground is that the Mashhadis came from Mashhad, the Jews from Mashhad. They had the same background, the same history, the same story. But in terms of character traits, my father he had really imbibed the values of Mashhad wholeheartedly. I can't say that's true for other fathers necessarily. And my mother was a rebel, and that was not typical of other Mashhadi mothers. They were well-behaved, quote unquote, deferential, reserved for the most part. My mother defied authority figures, and she was impulsive. So there was very little reflection. Whatever came through her mind came out of her mouth. That was not typical. That was not typical. So in both cases, they were extremes.
There was a question of how the Jews got to Mashhad. I don't want to spend time on that, but you spend time on that in the book, and it's very interesting, and explains how they landed up in Mashhad, why they were there. What we're talking about now is because they were there, what happened to them, and then what happened to you. There were some stories that did make me laugh. There was humor in the book, which I assume was intentional. And the funny thing about your father is that he is so extreme, but in many respects, he was right in many things. I don't want to go into the story about the post office. He was right, in looking back on it. And he was right about Barnard and the story of him going, what happens when he goes finally to see your room at Barnard. I don't know if we'll get there. It was slapstick. Really, it was very funny. But your father made you grow up in silence. And I should add that at some point, I guess when you're early on, your father shaved your head when you were young. And you talk about that and the experience having a shaved head in America. Your father would also get very upset because you did very well at school. So whereas most kids sit down with their parents and go through grades, and if you got A's and straight A's, your father and mother would congratulate you. It upset your father. He did not want you to be educated. He was very upset you got straight A's. He was very upset that you wanted to go to college. He was very upset that you moved to college. But he was also right in certain things. And so that it was very interesting to read that in the book and how it challenged you. But in some respects, he was right. In some respects, he was very wrong. But he really wanted you, he really created this environment of silence for you. So how did silence shape you?
Well, you know, Ari, you asked that I read something from the book, and I have a passage that addresses silence. So maybe we can cover both, a reading and the topic. I write, silence took root in me, and my need for solitude grew. On my 8th birthday, my eldest brother, Albert, bought me an easel, palette knife, canvas boards, and tubes of Grumbacher oil paint. From then on, I spent Sundays in my room with alizarin crimson, burnt umber, Indian yellow, and phthalo blue. After mixing fleshy heaps of pigment, I'd scoop, fling, and scrape, leaving behind Mom, Pop, PS 99, and any need for friends. I sailed into zones of shrieking colors that couldn't be heard by anyone other than me. Each hue had a breath, pulse, and tongue of its own. In this soundless space, my paints spoke loudly, and I listened intently, dabbling in portraits and landscapes, but preferring to lose myself in blissful, freedom-finding abstracts. I discovered I didn't want to put the world into words, that not every sensation had a matching name. Not every image or impulse could be explained. I began to believe that spoken language was artificial, formulaic, forcing me to shoehorn feelings into sentences while losing so much in translation. I preferred the primal feel of paint, paint that sang, cried, and killed, paint that said, I'm not rational, not civilized, not neatened up, I'm straight from the gut, muddy and messy, you can't tell me who I am, I'll tell you. I studied hard, did well in school, but struggled with an undisclosed secret. Words did not come easily. They came out backwards, in the wrong order, haltingly. I had to fight hard to retrieve a word, to verbalize thought, to translate flutters of feeling into language. My innards had potholes that swallowed up nouns, verbs, and adjectives before I could reach them. Words felt like little rebels, fugitives on the run, each with a warring will of its own. They made their own decisions, whether to stay or scram, help me self-express or leave me tongue-tied. And so I thought and spoke in shades of color.
as I mentioned, the writing is very good, and the stories are even more amazing. Wendy once wanted to know, I know it's in the book, but why did your dad shave your head when you were young?
Well, there's a chapter on that. I didn't understand it at the time. What his rationale was that if I shave your head, and he did this numerous times, you will eventually have thick, beautiful hair. So I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this for your future. But that wasn't what I was feeling. I was feeling that he was postponing my girlhood, that somehow he was making sure I didn't look like a female until he was ready for me to. That's kind of how I took it in. But I also learned later on that my father's father used to shave my father's head. And it was really a way of, I don't know how much of it was a custom. I really don't know what the real roots of it were, but it was something that got passed on and that my father then did to me, but did not do to my brothers. So it felt very much that it had something to do with being a female.
There's a story early on in the memoir where a friend came to visit you. I think it was Gwendolyn, and you were 8 years old, and you were standing next to your father, and Gwendolyn comes to the door and wants to see you, and your father says that you weren't there, and you were standing next to your father.
I'm standing right there.
What, can you, why do you think your father said that? I mean, you were standing right next to him.
Yeah. As a child, I was horrified because I was 8 and I would be going to school the next day, and I was afraid she was going to tell everyone that my father was crazy, and maybe I am too, that she saw me, I was standing next to him, and he said, she's not home. I was so afraid that she would go back and say, all Iranians are this way, and somehow I would be marked as crazy. But looking back, I mean, the book is written through the eyes of the child, the pre-adolescent, the adolescent, the young adult. And so my perceptions change, my understanding changes as I cognitively grow and start having more life experiences. Looking back, I really understand my father. Anyone that came from America or anything like mail that was going through our mail chute, front door chute, we lived in a house, was considered toxic, noxious, and should be kept out. He was very anti-America, even though he was living here, but he felt forced because my mother wanted to come and wanted to stay. And so even little 8-year-old Gwendolyn personified America for him. It was like she should be kept out at any cost. It was keeping out hedonism for him, immorality, that anyone who came from this culture was going to pollute our home, and that I would be influenced and polluted. That's definitely what it was all about. But as a child, I, of course, didn't understand it that way. I just thought he was crazy.
And there is a chapter where he does read a letter and save you from something. So again, read the memoir. You'll find that chapter quite interesting.
And he was wonderful in many ways. I don't want to paint this black picture. He was a very kind and nurturing man. And I have chapters of where I begin to understand this other side that he would hide and he wouldn't want us to know. That was extremely caring. And he had kind of a Mother Teresa inside of him, where he loved to heal anyone who was sick and knew how to be very healing, and looked after birds that had broken wings. And there was always this need to fix and inject health. He had some wonderful sides to him. And even this beginning that I write about, Gwendolyn, was all meant to protect me. It wasn't because he was an evil man, heaven forbid. He was actually a very kind, caring man. But through his lens, he was protecting me from America.
You and I talked before the program about the Mashadi Jewish community. So our understanding is there aren't any Jews left. The journalists went back recently, you told me, to go see if there are any and couldn't find any.
Right.
But the Mashadi community can be found in pockets around the world. Yes. You mentioned a few places to me. Maybe you could share those places, but I wanted to focus on the New York community. So where can they be found today? Where can you find Mashadi Jews?
Well, Mashadi Jews, they have a community in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, I'm sure in other cities in Israel, but I know the ones in Tel Aviv and Israel. And they have a community in Milan, Italy. They're very tight-knit. They tend to live close to one another and go to the same synagogue and socialize. They have a community in Hamburg, Germany, one in London. There is one in Great Neck, New York. Those are the major communities.
And I think you told me before that they're very insular and that they tend not to marry out of their own community. They won't even marry like Jews from Tehran. Is that correct?
Well, it's hard to say that they won't, because at times it happens, of course, but their wish is to stay within the community. The wish is that their children should grow up and marry one another. Although with time that is changing, and there are Mashadis in New York who are allowing their sons and daughters to marry Ashkenazi Jews. But their preference is to marry from within the community.
Now, when was this book published?
It came out last April. So a year ago, April, it came out in April 2020.
And I was going to ask, before I jump into how it's been received by certain parts of the Jewish community and so on, I want to jump back into the book for 1 second. There are some memories that are when you were so young. How is it possible that you remember when you were 2 or 3? Because I can barely remember what I did last week. So do you have that kind of memory that you really remember so many details of being that young? I assume from the book you wrote down as you got older, so you have those memories to go to. But I just wanted to ask a question of your memory and how you really were able to get back that far in your life.
Well, it's a two-part answer. I do have very, very sharp, clear memories of early childhood. So my memory is good, but in addition, it's the writing process. And that was a discovery for me. As I was writing my story, memories started to emerge, and I suddenly felt flooded. I think of a memory as like a yarn. And as I'm pulling up the yarn, I have this very clear memory of a certain incident. And as I'm pulling it up, it's as if it has threads. And there's another thread attached to it. And that would be, oh my goodness, I do remember my father shaving my head, and that came later. And I started remembering more and writing about it. And then I would write about that, and there would be, oh yes, and attached to that memory was another. So it's the writing process in addition to having a clear memory. You can talk about your life ad infinitum, but when you write about your life, it does awaken buried stories.
How long did it take you from when you started writing to when you finished the book?
This was a 5-year project, and I was devoted to it and writing every day, taking it very, very seriously. But there were a lot of changes, and I would be adding and subtracting and altering the order and thinking and experiencing. And so it was quite a process, but it took 5 years.
LD and Wendy keep asking questions that are all in the book. They want to know, if did you marry a Mashadi Jew? Did your parents make you marry someone? Maybe we'll get there, because it's definitely in the book and it's definitely part of the story. But I wanted to ask you, so the book came out. What reaction did you get first from the Mashadi community? Did people read it? Did people call you? And the second related question is, did people call you and say, oh, I had similar type experience to you? So the first question is, what was the reaction? Because you do air a lot of stuff. I mean, particularly about women and how they're brought up in this community and their challenges in America. Were people upset that you published this book from the Mashadi community?
I didn't experience that. I was inundated by emails and phone calls. Many were thanking me for penning the story. You know, it is a story about crypto Jews that has not been told firsthand. You can Google Jews of Mashhad, and Wikipedia will tell you the facts as to how they lived underground, but no one has written a memoir telling it personally, transparently, openly, uncensored. And so I was applauded by many for having the courage to do it, for sharing the story with the world, for putting them on the map. And of course, the rest is my own personal story. It's my father, it's my mother. I'm not writing about their mothers or their fathers. It's what happened in my living room growing up. But beyond the Mashadi community, you know, the book has been very warmly received by people who are not necessarily Jewish, not Iranian, not necessarily female, saying that the book really spoke to them. And so I've been getting a lot of emails where people have said to me, the skeletal structure of the book is what happens when one doesn't fit into the paradigm of one's family. And that's what people have been relating to. You know, how do you manage, how do you navigate when you don't fit into the paradigm of your family? And in my case, you know, it's the Mashadi underground crypto Jews. That's the background. And I grew up concealing myself. As much as they were concealed in their way, I had to conceal who I was in order to make it through my life. And so how do you do that? How do you hold on to family and hold on to yourself? And many people identified with the struggle, with the humor, with the characters, which was delightful for me to see, but also very surprising, because I thought only I had that mother and that father and that combination, but they were distilling something more skeletal from the book, and enjoyed it tremendously. So it has universal appeal.
There are some stories in the book that really don't involve you directly, so you must have heard them from other people. Did you interview people for the book from your family? Did you talk to your brothers? People have asked, and I'll ask, how do your brothers, what do they think of the book? Because they're in it, and they actually come out very heroic. They're the ones that really raised you in many respects, raised you to be American. Some great chapters if you go and visit them in college, and them taking you, you know, to get certain products and giving you the birds and the bees story. That's who gave it to you, not your parents. It's beautiful. But so how did they react to it? Did you talk to them about the book? Did you get memories from them that you shared in here?
Well, my brothers were always very supportive, and they were heroic figures throughout my life. And I felt they placed me on their shoulders and they wanted me to reach for the stars. And they did this all secretly. We had to do this very quietly and carefully. But they did play a very significant role. So yes, they were pleased. And I did ask lots of questions. My brother Albert, who's the eldest, he's 10 years older than myself, he was able to remember a lot about Iran. a lot about their exodus, which was horrific, because in the 1940s, when they were about to leave, they could not jump on a TWA plane and arrive in New York. There were no commercial flights. And so to leave Iran was by horse, buggy, foot, get into Afghanistan, then from there take a train to India, and then they were stuck in India for 13 months. And it was quite a saga. And then even arriving finally to the States, they were on an American troop ship that brought them from what was then called Bombay, today it's Mumbai, and brought to the United States. And it's like a Fellini movie, that troop ship story, as to the characters in there and what was going on. And Albert had very, very clear memories, which my mother verified. And my father would nod and say, yes, all of that truly happened. And so I did ask lots of questions growing up, and certainly recently more. I also have relatives that lived next to my parents in Mashhad, in that ghetto. And I asked them lots of questions about what it was like when my parents first married, and who was my mother and how did she behave. And a lot of what I had already known was being validated. And then I did research. And then there's just research about the Jews of Mashhad. So I did do a lot of work. Yeah.
In the memoir, you include many vignettes of a complex life and a challenge of living in America as a first-generation American with parents from Mashhad. One of the stories that really bothered me, it was very touching, but bothered me, was your father's first Friday night foray in New York City to services. Can you share that story with us, and then the ramifications of that when he went to try to go to Friday nights? Is just a ride. By the way, how long was the boat ride for them from
40 days.
40 days on a troop ship to get to California, and then to make their way from California to New York. They get to New York. Your father, for the first time, wants to go daven. He's been praying. The Jews of Mashhad would pray underground. They were, as Esther mentioned, they were crypto Jews. Above, they lived like Muslims above, but they had private secret prayer groups. So he comes to New York. He wants to go to a synagogue. He goes downstairs, goes to the first synagogue on Friday night. And can you tell the group what happened?
Yeah, they were living they had found a 1-bedroom apartment in Manhattan that they rented. And it was the first Friday night in the United States. And he was very excited, and he wanted to take his 2 sons, my brothers, to Friday night services. And there was a synagogue just a few blocks away. My mother dressed up the boys and put them in these little navy blue suits with red ties. And everyone looked very, very well put together. And my father took the boys, and my mother stayed home in order to prepare dinner. And the boys went off. So they went to this synagogue. It was an Orthodox synagogue. I'm not going to name names. And there was someone who was greeting the congregants as they were entering the shul. And this man said to my father, "Where are you from?" And my father spoke English fluently because he had spent a few years in London. When he was 16 years old, his father had sent him to London. So he spoke English fluently, and he said, "I'm from Persia." And the man said, "Are you Jewish?" And my father said, "Of course." And then he spoke to my father in a tongue that my father could not understand. And my father said, "I'm sorry, I don't understand what you just said." And he said, "I just spoke to you in Yiddish. And if you don't understand Yiddish, you're not Jewish." And so he blocked the entrance to the shul. And my father grabbed the 2 boys and headed home furious, absolutely livid. I heard this story 1,000 times because I wasn't born yet. So this happened before me. And so he came home, and he was ranting and raving, and he said to my mother, "I told you we never should have come to America. This place is not for us. I rather live in a country that tells us we're Jewish and then wants to kill us for being Jewish than be in a country that tells us we're not Jewish." And of course, that also infuriated my mother when she heard the story. But again, she was a very strong character and would never allow anyone to stand in her way. And so the next morning, she told everyone to get dressed again and that they were going to go to another synagogue. And there was another one a few blocks away that was a conservative shul. And they went there for Saturday morning services. And there was someone greeting congregants at the front of the shul, and he asked the same question of my father. He said, "Where are you from?" And my father bristled because of what he had just experienced. And he said, "Persia." And the man said, "Come right in." And he took my father, my mother, my two brothers, seated them right up front in shul, went up and spoke to the rabbi who was behind the podium at the time and whispered something into his ear. And this was Rabbi Goldberg, who I wrote about. And Rabbi Goldberg said that he's going to put his sermon aside, and in place of his sermon, he'd like to welcome these Jews from Persia, and told the story of Queen Esther and the whole history of Persian Jews, and elevated them and celebrated them. And it was a very meaningful experience. And my parents, he asked them to stand up so everyone could see them and know them. And of course they did. And they were crying profusely because they had never been to an above ground synagogue, no less be surrounded by hundreds of people and be celebrated. I mean, this was so contrary to their history, and it was extremely meaningful. And consequently, they became members of that synagogue while they were living in Manhattan. They moved afterwards, but while they lived in Manhattan, they attended that shul.
Yeah, I just thought that was a great story. What's interesting is that, I mean, I try not to give away too much in the book, but since someone asked, you did have a first marriage. Maybe would you mind talking about that? And then a second one, which brings into play the world of Ashkenazi and Ashkenazi traditions. Can you talk about the first marriage and how it plays into the story, and the story with your dad in particular, I guess?
Right, but it has to be put into context because I wanted to go to Barnard College, and I made a deal with my father that if he would allow me to have an education and go to Barnard and be there for 4 years, that I would come home and be the daughter that he wanted me to be, and that I would not change in any way. And of course, one does change as one becomes more educated. And so I attended Barnard. I was an art history major. And at the end of those 4 years, but there are a lot of details, so I'm going to skip the details. You're going to have to read the book. A lot occurred during those years. I came home and I agreed to marry who my father felt I should marry, and I did that. The marriage did not work, and you'll have to read the book to understand why. And so I divorced and started fresh. I never had children, and I started fresh. And that was a drama and a trauma, certainly for my father, because back then, within his world, girls did not divorce husbands. This was totally taboo. And he was very, very afraid of my future. Because again, he could only think along the lines of the Mashadi principles and values. And so he thought that I would never have a future, that I would never be able to marry if I divorced. And on top of that, I'm an educated woman. That was another strike against me, that men wouldn't want me. So later in the book, a lot happens, and I marry an American, Ashkenazi, and we are still married. We have a very good marriage, and we had our children. But I really don't want to give too much away, because it's intricate, it's detailed, it's nuanced, and it can't be summarized in a couple of sentences.
So let's talk about what's not in the book, which is living as a Mashadi Jew with an Ashkenazi husband. So how did you raise your children with respect to traditions, those that you grew up with, the food you grew up with, versus Ashkenazi and his traditions?
Well, I always went to Ashkenazi synagogues. So for me, that was second nature. My parents did also. We always went to Ashkenazi shuls. It really wasn't, there was no conflict of interest. Basically, I wanted to raise the children in an Ashkenazi way. I felt that there was more opportunity for them that way. And in terms of what did I bring in, they love Persian food. So occasionally, it's labor intensive and time intensive. So occasionally I would make them some Persian meals. But the children were raised as Jews. And I think that's really the bottom line. I don't think it's so much, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Sephardi. I think it's realizing that there really is one commonality. The belief in Judaism, the respect and love for the Torah and the principles and the morals that it expounds, the holidays that we observe in the same way, observing the Sabbath in the same way. And so there is a lot of sameness. There isn't as much difference as one would think.
How old are your kids now?
Oh, I have to stop and think. My son is in his late 30s, and my daughter is 34.
So what was their reaction to reading the book? Did you let them read like early drafts, or did you wait, give them a book, and what was their reaction once they read it?
Well, I wanted them to read the book when it was finally published, hard copy. It has photos in the book. I wanted them to see it as a completed entity. And so I did wait. Of course, they were nagging constantly, let me see, show me something. And I kept saying, you're going to have to wait because I want you to see the whole thing. And they loved it. They swallowed up the book in one day. I gave each of them a copy, and that evening they came racing back to me saying that they just loved it, and they were so appreciative that I had put the story down. They felt that I was memorializing our ancestors, keeping them alive, and giving their children, I have grandchildren, giving their children the story to hold on to, and the legacy and the history. And they loved the humor in the book. So for them, it was very meaningful, and they were deeply grateful.
I'm assuming that there's no way you would have written and published this book while your parents were still alive. Let's not focus on timing and how old they were and whether, but so I assume that's correct. Like, there's no way you would have published this. Would you have, if they had been alive, if your mom had lived a longer life, would you have published this book while she was alive? And if so, what do you think her reaction would have been?
I don't think that's the issue. I don't think it's about, first of all, my mother passed away. Let me figure this out. She passed away 21 years ago, and my father passed away 25 years ago. And I think the issue is not so much if she was alive, if she wasn't alive. Because one could say, well, you could have written the book right after she passed away. I mean, why did you wait 25 years? I think what I really needed was perspective. And I think that's what it really was about. I needed to grow. I needed to go through motherhood and experience grandmotherhood and see their lives through a different lens. So I needed these decades to consolidate as a person and also be able to step out of myself and be able to understand them through their lives. And that takes time to be able to do that accurately and authentically. So I think that was the real issue.
But what would you think, what would your mother say about the book though? Would they have been, well, what would your parents have said about this book? They come back, we have the, the Messiah comes, everybody comes back, your parents go to the bookstore and they buy the book. What happens?
You know, oddly enough, I think they'd be very proud because I learned a lot about my parents as they got older. And, you know, my mother always enjoyed people who took risks and had courage and defied the norm. She was highly anti-convention. And so the fact that I had the courage to do this, I think that knowing her, she would have been proud. My father is an interesting person because as much as he banned books and didn't want me to learn to read, and here I am writing a book today, when I married Ira, my husband, and had my children, and developed a private practice, because I am a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, he was so proud of me. And we would at times attend a Persian wedding, a Persian function, and he would loop arms with me and take me around and introduce me to his peers and proudly introduce me as Dr. Amini. Now, number one, I'm not a doctor. So he was inflating it and making it more. And I would say to myself, you know, silently, this is the man that didn't want me to read, and he's so proud that I've become a professional. And what I understood from all of that, and this ties into your question, is that he was very afraid of the end result. He believed that an educated girl would become a whore, and he would say that. He'd say, educated women become prostitutes. They become sexually promiscuous. And that was his equation. Well, I didn't become a prostitute. I married a wonderful man. We had and have a great life. And he was very, very proud of who I became at the end. And I think that was his main concern, that I not go astray. And I think he too, in his way, would applaud me.
My last question is, well, it's like a two-part question. What is a psychoanalytic psychotherapist? Because that's what you are. And the second question is, how has your life experiences informed your work as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist?
Well, the psychoanalytic part is having been trained. The theory has a lot to do with understanding the preconscious, the subconscious, the unconscious, so that when you are listening to your patients, you are listening to the material that's being presented, but you're also listening to what isn't being presented, and all the underpinnings, the developmental underpinnings, and where that person may be stuck developmentally, and what the unconscious conflicts might be, not just the conscious conflicts. So in short, that's what that is. And your second question was, how did that inform me in terms of my writing?
How did the your life experience inform your work as a therapist?
My life experience very powerfully informed my work. I think becoming highly, I think because of my own life, I'm highly sensitized to the whole theme of attunement and being heard and being understood, and wanting to hear others and give them the kind of attunement that perhaps they haven't received or have trouble receiving. I think language, the fact that my father would ban books, which is banning language, and ban sound. He did not want sound in the home. And he had his reasons. I mean, I can now look back and explain all of it. But that kind of upbringing has made me understand the value of finding words and finding words to label emotions, conflicts, what feels chaotic internally, which is an organizing factor. That language helps organize us internally, and consequently, we can then master what's happening internally. So, that kind of background has definitely fed into this appreciation for words.
Thank you. Well, thank you for sharing your words in your book. I have my book right here. It's my copy. I told my mom to order a copy as well, so I'm sure she will enjoy it. Thank you for being with us today and sharing your story and sharing the story about the Mashadi Jewish community, which I'd never heard of before. And everyone's going to go Google after the program, I assume. People have asked, are you available for book group talk? So I'll email people. I assume you are. I can email people if they're interested in hosting you. And yeah, I highly recommend reading the book. I think it's a page turner. The last question I will ask, someone had asked was, have you been approached yet about making a movie? Because this is like, the characters are so strong, and the storylines and some of the stories are so funny or so serious, so touching that, you couldn't make it up. You just can't make it up. But so that's the question. Have you been approached yet to make this into some kind of film or Netflix or anything like that?
Well, I haven't been approached yet, although some of my stories were taken by HiFlix, which is the Jewish Netflix, and they are streaming them. But as a film, like the whole book being turned into a film, I would love that. But so far, no one has approached me. It is very cinematic. It's colorful and very, I can see it as a film, there's no question. And those of you who would like to contact me, it's very easy. If you just go to my website, EstherAmini.com. Esther Amini is one word.com. You have my website there, and there is a tab to click to contact, and you can contact me that way. I'd be happy to respond. And I just wanted to throw in one more line, that those of you who have read the book and loved it, if you would consider giving it 5 stars on Amazon, because Amazon, as you know, is very, very powerful, and it promotes those books that get the most 5 stars. And so this would be your way of launching the book into the outer world. So something to consider.
So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Paul Lips, for joining us from Israel. Please do read the book. I get no share in anything. So I'm just telling you, read the book because you will thank me later. It really is an experience. I'm a first-generation American. Actually, I'm an immigrant, and we had challenges acculturating, but nothing like what Esther went through in the book. And very happy to hear about your family and your children and grandchildren. Thank you, everybody. Good to see you. Bye-bye. Take care.